Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, there's been another mass killing of Dogon villagers in central Mali. There's still confusion about the extent of the death toll as it ranges from 14 to over 40. Also, the UN warns that more than 300,000 people have fled into ethnic violence in northeastern DR Congo this month alone. The risks exacerbate efforts to tackle an Ebola epidemic that has claimed more than 1,400 lives since August. And hundreds of influential women from across Africa's private sector meet in Paris for the Women in Business meeting. Things are changing, but gender equality is still elusive, and this year's edition is taking a particular look at women in science. But first, more Dogon villages have been attacked by unidentified gunmen on motorbikes in central Mali. The number of dead given is ranged from 14 from officials to 40 by some locals. It's still not clear also who was behind the attack. It happened on Monday on the villages of Gan-Fafani and Yoro and come after last week's attack on another Dogon village. In March, 150 Fulani herdspeople were massacred in one of the worst attacks in the country's history. The government is overall struggling to rein in the violence. Bram Postumus tells us more about the latest bloodshed.
Two villages called Yoro and Ganyafani in the Mopti region, the same region where a lot of this violence has been happening, were attacked yesterday and today with the loss of 41 lives now all told. As you mentioned also, majority Dogon, although framing this in ethnic terms is always hazardous because it's a multifaceted conflict, but the cycle is continuing. There's been a quest for resources between the various people who are in this area where the state has abandoned them. That's the second condition that we have to mention. And then the third condition is the influence under which this has been becoming more violent, is the influx of terrorist elements and their arms. What's significant about the latest spate of these tit-for-tat violence is the fact that there is a lot more loss of life. Previously, a couple of people were killed, already bad enough. Now it's in the dozens, and this is to do with the use of AK-47s, whereas previously people would use homemade guns, which obviously are also lethal, but kill a lot fewer people.
A resurgence of clashes in eastern DR Congo has displaced hundreds of thousands of people since the beginning of the month. The situation in Ituri province has seen a spike in violent attacks between the Hema and Lendu groups. Nicolas Chemin tells us more.
The camp for internally displaced people in Bunia, Ituri's provincial capital, keeps getting bigger. Congolese are fleeing interethnic violence in the region. More than 300,000 people have had to abandon their homes since early June, according to the UN.
We were in the fields when we heard about the violence. We ran to our homes. They had been set alight. Some people were burnt alive inside the houses. They killed people with machetes. We managed to flee here.
Local officials said dozens of people have been killed in recent days. It's not clear what started the violence, but the UN said the Hema and Lendu ethnic groups were involved in revenge killings.
We saw our villages being burnt and our people die, but we had no weapons, so we couldn't do anything. I lost a lot of members of my family and my wife's family. One of my sister-in-laws was killed, along with her 5 children.
The Hema herders have long been in conflict with Lendu farmers over grazing rights and political representation. When Belgium was the colonial power, it had favoured the Hema and deepened divisions. The worst clashes took place between 1999 and 2003. After many years of peace, there were more attacks in 2017 and 2018. The current violence is taking place in the northeast of the country, which is hit by an Ebola epidemic. It has claimed more than 1,400 lives since August. The interethnic killings and the displacement of people is now complicating the tracing and treatment of patients at risk of Ebola.
The late Egyptian president Mohamed Morsi was buried on Tuesday, a day after he collapsed and died in a Cairo courthouse. The 67-year-old had been on trial for espionage at the time. He became the country's first democratically elected leader back in 2012, but was forced from power in a coup in 2013 and arrested. Morsi's funeral was conducted under heavy security. His family say that authorities wouldn't allow him to be buried in his hometown of Sharkia. Morsi's Muslim Brotherhood has accused the government of hastening his death with years of poor prison conditions. In Mauritania, slavery was officially abolished about 40 years ago. But in reality, many activists say that people continue to work in slave-like conditions. Many of the Haratin community continue to be socially and administratively marginalized. They live in poverty and don't have the right to state help to send their kids to school or improve their lives. Our team report.
Brahim Ramdan is a human rights activist. He's visiting a family living in abject poverty in the heart of Nouakchott. They belong to the Haratin community. Living with almost nothing, including civil registration papers in their home country, is typical of the consequences of being descendants of former slaves. None of these 4 boys go to school. Their father works as a security guard, watching over the construction of this house.
These are jobs usually given to former slaves. Security guards, cleaners. They're very frequent cases. There are thousands of children like this in Nouakchott.
According to civil society groups defending the rights of the Haratins, the community is the poorest in the country. Their social exclusion means they also make up 85% of the country's illiterate. Brahim wishes there was more help from the government in tackling the inequality faced by the Haratin community.
There's a lot of talk, but in reality, nothing is done. If something was really being done, we wouldn't be here trying to send 1 or 2 children to school. There's a systematic injustice. It's racism at a governmental level.
Tadammoun, the National Anti-Slavery Agency, is also supposed to tackle poverty in the country. Officials insist the issue is taken seriously.
The government gives the Tadammoun agency 2% of its annual budget, 1% of its GDP. The agency's strategy is to start with the more remote areas.
The issue is at the heart of the manifestos of most candidates in the country's upcoming presidential election.
Well, currently, hundreds of influential women from across Africa's private sector are meeting in Paris for the 2nd year of the Women in Business meeting. It's a chance for participants to learn from each other, both on the strictly professional front and with regards to navigating some of the systemic challenges faced by women in positions of power. Things are changing, but gender equality can still be elusive, particularly in the focus of this year's edition, which is Women in Science. For more on this, I'm joined by Nathalie Munyampenda. She's the managing director of the Next Einstein Forum, which is a platform aiming to make Africa a global hub for science and technology. Nathalie, thanks so much for coming in to speak to me.
Thanks for having me.
First up, when it comes to tech innovation and Africa, how is the continent doing on that front? Because that is a goal of the Next Einstein Forum, the organization for which you work.
So it depends on where you are in Africa. There's not it's not the same across the continent. So we have places where we're doing very well, and primarily it's because they're investing in research and development. And they've kind of looked at every step, whether it's from high school, before high school, at the university, at the research level, what investments are needed. And it's not the same everywhere else. Also, we do not have the same system as Silicon Valley. I know there's a lot of buzzwords, but we do not have the venture capital funding. We don't have the funding instruments. We don't have the ability to scale up our ideas. We are not protecting our invention. So there's a lot of challenges currently, but there's also a lot of optimism because of the technology adoption across the continent. So this is the right time for Africa.
So also, I guess, the right time for women who have ambitions to kind of move forward in STEM industries in Africa to do so as well. Where do things stand with regard to women in tech innovation on the continent at the moment?
So I would say Africa is an advance in terms of having girls go into the sciences. What we're seeing the challenge, and particularly in postgraduate education, after the postdoctorate level, the situation gets very bad, is the retention of women in sciences and tech. And then we have very serious issues of harassment and other things that cause women to leave the career. So you'll have a woman who has a master's degree in industrial chemistry who could be building our drugs or seeing how to build our drugs at the pharmaceutical company, who's left that and is now a bank teller. There's also an issue of women not seeing science as a viable career And that ends up being cultural issues, as well as not seeing role models that are women who are leaders, who are scientists. So there's multiple layers of problems, but we're definitely doing better than Europe and other places.
Oh, what are those places?
Definitely France, for example. Here we are in France. In terms of women who are staying in the mathematical sciences, I work at the African Institute for Mathematical Sciences, and we have a quota system that keeps women, at least 30% of our students at the master's level are women. And in France, that number is lower than 10%. So we are doing better in terms of numbers, but what we're not seeing is the retention of women, and that's a global issue.
Thanks very much, Nathalie and Nathalie Munyampenda there. Unfortunately, that is all we have time for Eye on Africa. Thanks very much for joining us. Do so again. Take care.